The wind carried the smell of salt and cordite across the black sands of Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19, 1945. Ash clouds rolled low over Mount Suribachi, muting the sunlight into a metallic haze. Below the cliffs, thousands of Marines crouched in landing craft, engines rumbling beneath them like distant thunder. The Pacific waters slapped against steel hulls, and every man felt the tremor of what awaited beyond the surf, the unseen enemy watching from tunnels cut deep into volcanic stone. It was a morning of contradictions. The United States believed its men were hardened, trained, ready. Japan believed its warriors were unbreakable, rooted in centuries of martial tradition. Yet in the shadows of Suribachi, a truth had already settled into the minds of Japanese commanders. There was one opponent they feared in the Pacific above all others, the United States Marine Corps. Not because they were more numerous, not because they carried superior weapons, but because they fought with a tenacity, a rhythm, an unyielding persistence that seemed to defy logic, fatigue, and even death. To understand this rivalry, one must step back to the origins of the Pacific War, to a moment when Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea. The Japanese military was confident, victorious, and ideologically united by Bushido, the martial code that shaped every soldier from youth. Their early victories in 1937, 1938, 1941 painted a portrait of an unstoppable empire. But something changed when they faced the Marines. Guadalcanal, August 1942. A humid fog clung to the jungle canopy. Rain fell in sheets so heavy it seemed to erase the horizon. Beneath the palms, Marines dug in, their faces smeared with mud and fear. The Japanese believed their night assaults, honed in China and Southeast Asia, would break these American newcomers in hours. Instead they met a wall. A wall of rifle fire. A wall of grit. A wall of men who refused to run, who refused to surrender, who fought with a stubbornness that shook Japanese morale to its core. Years later, Japanese veterans spoke of these first clashes with disbelief. They were not human, one wrote. They kept coming. They noticed the way Marines moved, slow, deliberate, methodical, as if the chaos of jungle warfare sharpened their senses instead of overwhelming them. The battlefields of the Pacific became a theater of contrasts. Japan valued spirit, sacrifice, and ferocious offensives. The Marines valued discipline, coordination, and the fierce protection of one another. One side fought for empire, the other for survival, and the survival of the man next to them. This contradiction defined the entire Pacific War. Japan expected quick victories. The Marines delivered prolonged nightmares. From Tarawa's reefs to Peleliu's coral ridges, from Saipan's cliffs to Okinawa's hills, the pattern repeated. Japanese soldiers, convinced of their superiority in close combat, launched waves of night attacks, only to find Marines dug in deeper than expected, firing with terrifying accuracy. The Japanese High Command observed this trend with increasing anxiety. Reports to Tokyo described an enemy who does not break, whose morale increases under threat, who counters with overwhelming fire, and who seems bred for war in the Pacific. And so, a legend began to form, a legend not written by Americans, but by the very men ordered to stop them. A legend that shaped the psychological battlefield long before the physical one. The story of why Japanese disliked fighting American Marines more than any other unit is not simply about tactics, weapons, or victories. It is a story about perception, the shifting fear and respect between two elite warrior traditions. It is a story about what happens when ancient codes collide with new doctrines. When empires crash into democracies. When conviction meets endurance. And ultimately, it is a story that reveals a deeper truth about human conflict. The greatest battles are not fought over territory, but over the will to continue fighting. This is the chronicle of two forces staring into the abyss of war, and discovering in the other, a darkness that mirrored their own. A truth that transformed strategy, reshaped expectations, and redefined what each side believed about courage, sacrifice, and survival. In the end, the Japanese learned that the Marines were not merely enemies. They were a force shaped by harsh training, brutal environments, and an unshakable brotherhood, a combination Japan had underestimated. This is the story of why. Why their fear grew. Why their reports changed. Why the legend endured. And why, even today, veterans from both nations recall that the fiercest battles of the Pacific were fought not against armies, but against Marines. CTI, the build-up, storm before the collision. Before the first Marine ever stepped ashore in the Pacific, Japan had constructed its military identity on a foundation of centuries-old warrior philosophy. The Imperial Japanese Army trained its men to believe that death in battle was honorable, retreat was shameful, and surrender was unthinkable. From their earliest campaigns in China, they fought opponents who were often poorly armed, disorganized, or overwhelmed by Japan's speed and shock tactics. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, its leaders truly believed, that the United States lacked the unity and martial resilience to endure a long war. They expected Americans to negotiate, to fall back, to abandon distant territories. But there was one element of the American military they had not accounted for. The United States Marine Corps, a small force but one sharpened by decades of amphibious doctrine. Japanese miscalculations. Japanese planners committed 3 major miscalculations. Underestimating Marine training and organization. They saw them as a small expeditionary force, not a hardened attack force. Overestimating the psychological impact of banzai attacks. Japan believed massed night assaults broke the spirit of enemies, it had worked elsewhere. Believing Americans valued life too highly to fight with endurance. Japanese ideology assumed Americans would avoid high casualties. All 3 assumptions shattered at Guadalcanal. ICT-2, Turning Point, Guadalcanal and the Fall of Illusions. August 1942, the first major clash. When the Marines seized Henderson Field, it created the Japanese military's first strategic shock of the war. They had not expected the Marines to hold it, not against superior Japanese night fighting units, naval bombardment and relentless waves of infantry. The Japanese viewpoint. Japanese diaries on Guadalcanal reveal the psychological blow. They hid in the jungle like ghosts, but when attacked they fought like demons. Private Tanaka, 2nd Division. Their fire discipline was terrifying. 1 volley, and the jungle fell silent. Corporal Shiroku, 29th Infantry. Marines fought differently from other Allied forces the Japanese had encountered. They fired fewer rounds but each shot counted. They held lines even when isolated. They counterattacked in small, coordinated squads with machine guns, mortars and flamethrowers. This precision contradicted the Japanese worldview, that Westerners lacked the unity and resolve to match Bushido spirit. The tactical shift. Japan adapted. They began studying marine tactics. Marine firepower concentration, interlocking fields of fire, nighttime countermeasures, aggressive patrolling to deny infiltration, coordinated artillery and naval support. Reports circulated. The Marines fight with teamwork, not individual heroics. This makes them harder to break. Why this was devastating. Japan's doctrine relied on shock, a sudden overwhelming fury meant to frighten or confuse opponents. But the Marines reacted not with fear, but with calculated violence. Japan began to realize, their enemy was not just brave, he was systematic. ACT-3, Confrontation, across the Pacific's deadliest islands. Tarawa, November 1943. The Japanese commander, Shibasaki, boasted, "A million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. Yet the Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was horrific, thousands dead on both sides, but the psychological impact on Japan was staggering. Marines fought through choking reefs, machine gun nests, and interlocked bunkers with a resolve Japan had never expected. One Japanese survivor wrote, "I saw them wading through water already red with blood. They did not turn back. They came forward as if death meant nothing." Saipan, June 1944. Here, the Japanese Imperial Army shattered against Marine defense. After losing ground, the Japanese commander, General Saito, admitted, "We are facing a new breed of American, trained, fierce, ruthless in battle. These are not the men we fought before." Japan's largest ever banzai charge, 3,000 men, slammed into Marine lines. They were stopped. Polilliu, September 1944. A brutal crucible of coral and caves. Temperatures reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Marines fought yard by yard, flamethrower by flamethrower, against entrenched defenders who believed they were fighting to save the empire itself. Japan later described the Marines as a force that will not break even when drowning in fire. Iwo Jima, 1945. The ultimate symbol. The battle Japan expected to devastate American morale instead magnified Marine resolve. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi wrote privately, "The American Marines are not the same men we defeated before the war. Their fighting spirit is unmatched. I fear they are the greatest warriors in history." ICT-4, Human Elements, Voices from the Fire. Brief glimpses from letters and diaries. Marine Corporal's letter, Saipan. "We don't fight for medals. We fight so the guy next to us gets home." Japanese Sergeant, Iwo Jima. "When I shoot one, another Marine takes his place instantly. It is like fighting the sea itself." Marine radio chatter, Polilliu. "We're pinned, but we're holding. Hold the line. Hold the line. These fragments reveal the emotional core of the conflict. The Marines fought with unity. The Japanese fought with sacrifice. Both believed they carried their nation's destiny. But unity outlasted sacrifice. That truth reshaped the war. ICTV, consequences, psychological impact on Japan. Japan learned hard lessons. Banzai charges became almost useless against Marine firepower. Tunnel and cave systems slowed Marines but didn't stop them. Marine logistics, water, ammo, medics, kept them alive longer. Marine units rotated, reorganized, reinforced. Japanese units did not. Reports increasingly warned that Marines were the most formidable enemy in the Pacific. This was not admiration. It was fear wrapped in respect. ICT 6, Reflection, How the Marines Redefined Warfare. By 1945, senior Japanese commanders privately acknowledged that the Marines represented a fighting culture they had underestimated. A culture built not on ancient ideals, but on modern discipline, inter-unit loyalty, and unbreakable training. The conflict revealed a profound truth. War is not won by courage alone, but by cohesion. Japan's warrior ethos prized individual sacrifice. The Marines prized collective survival. In the end, the side that fought for each other outlasted the side that fought for honor alone. The smoke of battle eventually drifted away from the islands of the Pacific, leaving behind landscapes carved by fire and memory. What remained were the stories, quiet, sometimes whispered, sometimes written decades later, of two warrior cultures that collided with a force neither fully anticipated. As the war ended and Japan lay in ruins, a new era dawned. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific was gone. Its armies disbanded. Its ideology transformed. Yet among the surviving officers and soldiers, one memory endured: the Marines. Not as monsters. Not as invincible. But as the opponent who forced them to confront the limits of their own beliefs. The post-war years brought reflection. Japanese historians studied the Pacific campaigns with a cold, analytical eye. They discovered that the battles were not simply lost because of inferior resources or flawed strategy. They were lost because they had misjudged the nature of their enemy. The Marines were not the soft Americans Japanese propaganda had imagined. They were a brotherhood forged through relentless training, amphibious doctrine, and a culture that valued loyalty over individual glory. Japan also realized something deeper. The Marines were fighting a different kind of war, a war not for empire but for survival and return. This difference changed everything. In Japan's barracks and veterans associations, former soldiers shared stories of facing Marines on the ridges of Saipan, the cliffs of Okinawa, the sulfur fields of Iwo Jima. Many spoke with a tone that merged respect and sorrow. They were fierce because they fought for each other. They did not want to die, but they were willing to. Their courage came not from honor, but from duty. These reflections reveal a striking irony. Japan's warriors, shaped by centuries of martial tradition, came to admire the spirit of a force that had no ancient code, only the code of the present, sharpened by harsh necessity. The legacy of these confrontations reshaped both nations. The United States emerged from the Pacific War with a new understanding of global responsibility and military power. The Marine Corps, once a small expeditionary force, became a symbol of American resolve. Japan, in contrast, took a different path. Its new constitution renounced war. Its society embraced peace, technology, and economic growth. Yet the memory of the Marines, their persistence, their discipline, their unity, remained part of the post-war study of military science and psychology. In time, the two nations became allies. The former enemies trained together, learned from each other, and rebuilt trust. The bitter memories of the Pacific softened, replaced by a shared commitment to stability and cooperation. But even as the decades passed, one image lingered, a symbolic fragment from the story of the Pacific War. A Marine climbing out of the surf, drenched, exhausted, wounded, yet moving forward. That image, repeated across dozens of islands, became the embodiment of what Japan had feared. Not brute strength, not superior numbers, but the simple refusal to stop. The moral irony of the war is clear. Japan believed that absolute sacrifice would create an undefeatable army. The Marines proved that the will to live, and to bring your brothers home, is even stronger. In this, the story transcends the Pacific. It speaks to the nature of human endurance, to the power of unity, to the truth that the fiercest strength arises not from ideology, but from connection. As the narrator of history steps back from the scorched beaches and windswept ridges of that long-ago war, one understanding remains. The Marines were feared not because they sought death, but because they fought to preserve life. They were relentless not because they had nothing to lose, but because everything they loved waited beyond the horizon. And so, the final lesson echoes softly across time. In the great struggles of humanity, the most powerful force is not the sword, the rifle, or the code, but the enduring bond between those who stand together. That is why Japanese soldiers disliked fighting American Marines. Not because they were unbeatable. Not because they were perfect. But because, in the crucible of war, they revealed a truth Japan had not expected. A united people cannot easily be broken. And in that truth lies the universal message of this history, a message that reaches far beyond the beaches of the Pacific. Strength is temporary. Fear is fleeting. But loyalty endures.